Next up, we're going to dive into the fascinating world of demographics and sociology, where a surprising trend is emerging. The wealthy are starting to have more babies than the poor again. I'm excited to explore this topic with my co-host today as we discuss what this means for our understanding of status, privilege, and social inequality.
Wow, that's, quite a reversal from what we've seen in the past, right? I mean, didn't we used to think that wealthier people had fewer kids because they were more educated and had better access to birth control?
Exactly. And that was true for a long time. But now, researchers are finding that in countries that have already gone through what's called demographic transition, the old relationship between status and affluence on the one hand, and number of children on the other, is starting to reestablish itself. This means that wealthy individuals are having more kids, while poorer people are having fewer.
That's really interesting. So, what's driving this change? Is it just a matter of wealthier people being able to afford more kids? Or is there something else going on?
Well, it's not just about affording more kids. In fact, researchers have found that among men, there's now generally a positive relationship between income and education level and fatherhood. For example, in the US, a census survey found that 70% of men with graduate or professional degrees had children, while only about 49% of those without a high school diploma did.
Whoa, that's a big difference. And what about women? Is the same pattern holding true for them?
Great question. For women, the relationship between income and education and births is still a bit more complicated. Overall, in the US, the relationship remains negative, meaning that wealthier, more educated women tend to have fewer kids. But among certain groups, like white, non-Hispanic women, the curve is becoming U-shaped, with those with bachelor's degrees or higher having more kids than those with some college.
Okay, got it. So, it sounds like there are some nuances here. But what about the broader implications of this trend? You mentioned that it could lead to a new era of social and economic stratification.
Yes, exactly. If family size becomes a key indicator of status and privilege, that could further exacerbate existing inequalities. I mean, think about it. If wealthy people are having more kids, they're going to have more opportunities to pass on their wealth, education, and social connections to their children, which could create a kind of self-reinforcing cycle of privilege.
That's really scary. Actually, I mean, we already know that there are huge disparities in access to education and healthcare and all sorts of other resources. If family size becomes another factor that contributes to those disparities, it could be really difficult to reverse.
Absolutely. And it's not just about individual families. This trend also has implications for societal demographics as a whole. I mean, if wealthy people are having more kids, that could affect the overall population growth rate and even influence things like economic development and social cohesion.
Right. Okay. So what can we do to address these issues? Are there any potential solutions or policy interventions that could help mitigate the negative effects of this trend?
Well, researchers are suggesting that accommodating women's career ambitions might be essential to staving off further declines in fertility rates. For example, in Nordic countries where men take on more housework and childcare responsibilities, fertility rates are actually higher.
That's really interesting. So it sounds like getting dads more involved in childcare could be a key part of the solution.
Exactly. And it's not just about individual families. Policymakers can also play a role by implementing policies that support work-life balance and provide access to affordable childcare. It's a complex issue, but by understanding the underlying trends and patterns, we can start to think about ways to address them and create a more equitable society for everyone. Next up, we're going to explore the fascinating topic of how wealth and status are once again becoming linked to having more children, a phenomenon that's being observed in many developed countries. I'm excited to dive into this conversation with my co-host, who's new to this topic, and see where it takes us. Today, we're discussing the Great Reversal, how wealth and status are redefining fertility. Yes, you heard that right. The wealthy are starting to have more babies than the poor again.
That sounds really interesting. I mean, I've always thought that, poor people have more kids because they can't afford birth control or something. But, if that's not the case anymore, then what's going on? Right.
Well, let's take a step back and look at history. For most of human history, having more children was actually a status symbol, especially for men. I mean, think about it. Genghis Khan, one of the most notorious examples, is estimated to have had thousands of children, and it wasn't just him. many wealthy and powerful men throughout history have had large families as a way to demonstrate their status and wealth.
Whoa, that's crazy. I had no idea. So like having kids was a way to show off your wealth? How did that work exactly?
Exactly. Having children was a sign of virility, power, and wealth. And it wasn't just about the number of children, it was also about the ability to provide for them and give them a good life. But then, with the Industrial Revolution and the rise of modern society, things started to change.
Okay, I think I see. So like, as people got richer and more educated, they started having fewer kids? That makes sense? I guess. But why is that happening again now?
Ah, great question. Research suggests that in developed countries, the relationship between wealth and fertility is becoming positive again. In other words, wealthy and educated men are now more likely to have children than their less affluent counterparts. And it's not just about the money, it's also about the changing roles of men and women in society.
That's really interesting. I never thought about how masculinity and male identity might play a role in fertility decisions. Can you explain more about that?
Sure, the positive relationship between men's income and education level and fatherhood raises questions about the role of masculinity and male identity in shaping fertility decisions. It seems that traditional notions of masculinity are being redefined to include paternal responsibilities and emotional labor. Men who are more educated and wealthy are now more likely to see themselves as caregivers and nurturers, not just breadwinners.
Wow, that's a really big shift. I mean, I can think of some guys I know who are totally hands-on dads, but I'm not sure if that's the norm yet. Do you think this is related to the whole dads doing more housework thing?
Exactly. Research has shown that in countries where men take on more domestic responsibilities, fertility rates tend to be higher. It's as if men are saying, hey, I want to be a dad and I'm willing to do my part to make it work. And it's not just about the dads, it's also about creating a society that supports families and makes it easier for people to balance work and family life.
That makes sense. I mean, if guys are expected to be more involved in childcare, then maybe they'll be more likely to have kids in the first place. Right? But what about women's roles in all this? How do they fit into the equation?
Ah, great question. Women's roles are changing too, and it's not just about them having fewer children. In some countries, like Sweden, research has shown that women with higher incomes and education levels are now having more children than their less affluent counterparts. It seems that as women's career ambitions are being accommodated, they're also feeling more confident about having families.
Whoa, that's really cool. I mean, it's like, the more we support women's careers, the more likely they are to have kids? That's a pretty interesting finding, right?